Ash Ketchum stood on a high hill overlooking the port town of Vermilion City, his partner and first Pokémon, Pikachu, perched comfortably on his shoulder. Behind him stood his friends, Brock, Misty and Jizelle, who had just joined him atop the hill and were now looking out over the city as well. "It's a nice looking place," Jizelle commented idly. Ash nodded. "Yeah, it is. I'm more concerned with the Pokémon Center we'll find down there though. My Pokémon deserve a nice rest." He finished with a smile up at Pikachu. It had been 2 weeks since they had left Bill's lighthouse, and in that time, he and his Pokémon had been training like mad. Doing all they could to prepare themselves for whatever they would face when they finally challenged the Vermilion Pokémon Gym. Ash had been training so hard himself that he actually felt his muscles repairing the damage he had done to them over the last 2 weeks. All of the Pokémon he had with him had grown by leaps and bounds since departing from Bill's. Especially Pikachu. He had hit another growth spurt, as Ash liked to call his starter Pokémon's unnatural gains in power that he would randomly experience. The little electric type kept getting stronger with seemingly no limit in sight and in such a short amount of time too. The second Pokémon he had with him was Charmander. The young fire type had also marked up incredible gains in power over the last 2 weeks. He had even learned the new moves Flame Burst and Slash. He now knew, altogether, Ember, Smokescreen, Fire Fang, Slash, Dragon Rage and Flame Burst. Charmander had been growing so fast and becoming so strong in such a relatively short amount of time being on Ash's training program that he wondered what Damien would say if he saw his old Pokémon now. The third Pokémon he had with him was Bulbasaur. The quadruped grass type had learned new moves as well, but his real accomplishment had been the gains in raw power he had been making. So much so that Ash could easily say Bulbasaur was now at least 3 times stronger than he was at Melanie's cottage. The new moves he had learned thanks to his trainer's brutal, but effective training regimen were Double Edge and Synthesis. As a whole, Bulbasaur now knew the moves: Razor Leaf, Vine Whip, Sweet Scent, Poison Powder, Sleep Powder, Leech Seed, Double Edge, Growth and Synthesis. Squirtle was the 4th Pokémon he had on his team currently, and the water type had also grown impressively in his own right. He had managed to even learn the new moves Protect and Water Pulse. At present, his arsenal of attacks tallied up to Tackle, Bite, Water Pulse, Protect, Bubble and Rapid Spin. Pidgeotto was the 5th Pokémon Ash had on him at present, and she had grown not only stronger but also faster over the last 2 weeks they've been traveling. An impressive feat to be sure, considering how great her speed had already been. She also had learned 2 new moves due to the rigor of their training, one in which surprised him. The first was Roost and the second was Wing Attack. It was surprising she had already attained use of that move because, typically, Pidgeotto didn't learn Wing Attack until they evolved into their final evolutionary stage, Pidgeot. But then again, he had her train in such an unusual manner that it really shouldn't have been all that surprising in the first place. The final member of Ash's team was his newest and arguably most unique Pokémon. This being, of course, the giant Dragonite who had decided to go with him back at Bill's lighthouse. It had been extremely hard for Ash to design an effective and functional training program for Dragonite. Both because she was so immense and also due to the fact that she had such power in her attacks. So much so they had to be very careful where they trained, lest any passerby people or Pokémon be injured. Or, even worse, killed. In the end, he had decided on 2 methods for approaching her training. For the physical portion of it, Ash had decided to make use of objects in the environment for her body weights. She would use such things as large trees and immense boulders for weights, in order to do her strength training. When it came to working on her raw power and attacks, however, he took a different approach. The only way to improve the already awesome and sheer destructive force of her attacks was to have her use them, repeatedly, as fiercely and relentlessly as she could. While doing this was hard depending on where they were, in relation to the terrain around them, almost everything she did concerning her attacks were done aerially so as to avoid mass destruction of anything on the ground. To avoid being seen by prying and unwanted eyes, Ash would always wait to train with Dragonite until nighttime. While she didn't get to train with his other Pokémon, they did get to have one-on-one time together, so it was an even trade-off. Many of the physical training exercises he had her do covered almost everything his other Pokémon did, just with a few obvious modifications. For example, he would have her work upon her cardio and stamina by taking flight to the darkened skies at night while carrying the largest boulders they could find in her arms. In this way, she would fly until exhaustion, weighted down as she was by the several hundred extra pounds. Another method he had thought up was having her ascend as high as possible into the sky so she could practice flying at extreme elevations. This essentially made up for the lack of resistance training tools she had available to her because of her gargantuan stature. The sky and gravity itself was not limited to size, which meant she had a constant form of resistance awaiting her merely a few wingbeats away in the heavens. Such was especially true if it was raining. Her wings would become weighed down with the water and thereby make it that much more difficult on her to fly. Moreover, in the case of a thunderstorm, she would even be able to work on her speed, agility and evasive maneuvering by dodging bolts of lightning. When it came to improving upon her aerial acrobatics and other such physical mechanics, Ash had her take large trees and boulders with her in flight. Then, while holding onto her own personalized free weights, she performed a wide array of movements and maneuvers that further improved her overall conditioning. Even her attacks did Ash have her practice up in the sky. That was especially interesting to witness since her incredibly powerful moves, such as Dragon Rage, would cause massive explosions. Such was the case that if anyone were to look skyward while she trained, it would have been like seeing fireworks going off. In all truth, there really wasn't any kind of training that Dragonite could actually do on the ground, since any time she would move, or Arceus forbid, jump, it would feel like an earthquake had been set off. Something in which was assured to frighten any people or Pokémon within even a remote vicinity. Overall, neither of them minded it. Dragonite received much better training in the air rather than on the ground anyway. And since it limited on the potential for her to be seen, all the better. If there was thing that training so thoroughly with her confirmed was that he would not be able to use her in ordinary trainer battles or gym matches. She was simply too powerful to risk hurting other people's Pokémon, or worse. Another method of training that Ash himself engaged in concerning Dragonite was a form of bond and trust building exercises. She would simply lift him up and place him on her head before flying with him, essentially riding on her. If that wasn't enough, he also had her perform different attacks while carrying him. This, quite naturally, caused for an extreme degree of control on her part, since one mere slip-up would spell certain death for her trainer. In much the same manner, she would also perform different aerial acrobatics while in the sky that required him to trust her completely. Relying on the knowledge that she knew what she was doing and would not let him fall off. The first time he did such a thing with her was quite the fearful experience, but after safely being flown through the heavens with not so much as a near slip, he became instantly addicted. In all actuality, it became the perfect bonding activity for the two of them to do together and helped to build their relationship beautifully. His friends had prior observed, after the second or third time they went flying, that Ash was almost invisible while astride Dragonite. Due to her massive size, he apparently appeared as little more than a speck on her head. When he was flying with her, there were times where he would look back and try to see where Dragonite's tail was, but he never could. It was like standing directly underneath a skyscraper and trying to see to the top of it with the sun glaring in your eyes. She was simply too big. Pikachu had even taken to flying with them after watching Ash do it a few times. He was just like his trainer. After flying just one time, he was utterly hooked. Pikachu always rode in the same spot, which was safely tucked into Ash's lap. Not a single night went by that he didn't ride with them. Needless to say, the daily flights had been so good for bonding that Pikachu and Dragonite became fast friends rather quickly. He had tried to get Brock, Misty and Jizelle to ride with them, but the former two had vehemently denied, saying they were perfectly happy staying safely down on the ground while Ash and Dragonite had their late-night flying sessions. He supposed the intimidation on their parts also came from the fact that, During Dragonite's first ever takeoff as his Pokémon, the sheer power of the gust that came from her wings blew almost everything in their campsite away. Not only that, but there were even several smaller trees that became uprooted and tossed in all directions by the windstorm churned up by her powerful wings. Although, thankfully, none of them were hit by any of the wayward trees. Jizelle was the only one who went flying with them. At first, the young brunette had been quite unnerved at the prospect of taking flight bareback on such a gigantic Pokémon, but after the first time she, much like Ash and Pikachu, became enamored with the experience. Interestingly enough, by trusting Dragonite enough to fly with her, Jizelle had become the pseudo-legendary's favorite human next to Ash. Which was rather evident by the way she would frequently get nuzzled by the once lonely Pokémon. Ash knew, by sheer observation, that such a bond had been formed by Jizelle trusting Dragonite, which in turn earned the sea-dwelling dragon's own trust and respect. He had read many times that dragon-type Pokémon were very proud creatures that responded well to mutual acts of trust and respect. And thus far, with Dragonite, it seemed to be true. While they had only been together a relatively short time and still had a long ways to go as trainer and Pokémon, naturally, Ash and Dragonite had grown very close and established a solid bond. Their training, time spent together and reciprocal respect for the other had caused their relationship to blossom well beyond what most would consider possible in such a short time. In fact, in only their first 2 weeks of being together, Dragonite had already mastered the attacks she had known for years. Her strength, stamina, speed, power and even agility had increased exponentially. Moreover, she had even managed to learn new moves as well. She now knew Twister, Fire Punch, Thunder Punch, Roost, Thunder Wave, Dragon Rage, Agility, Dragon Tail and Hurricane. All in all, everything had gone exceedingly well, far beyond Ash's own expectations. While he had initially been worried and even had some doubts about his ability to train such a Pokémon as Dragonite, his tenacity, intelligence, drive and, of course, the unwavering support of his friends and Pokémon, Dragonite herself included, all contributed to their success. Two things he had been, admittedly, concerned over was how she would react to life in a Pokéball, as well as how she would fit into his growing family of Pokémon. Both of which proved to be completely unfounded concerns. Even though Dragonite was indeed a gargantuan Pokémon, her Pokéball apparently fit her just as ideally and comfortably as it did any other. It was both intriguing for Ash, as well as relieving, to learn that size truly didn't matter when it came to Pokémon and their Pokéballs. Each one was made to suit their own unique tenant. And of course, Dragonite and all of his other Pokémon got along perfectly well. They had accepted her into the family, with not so much as a moment's hesitation, bringing the once isolated ocean wanderer true joy that she had never truly known before. Dragonite finally had what she always desired the most, and that was a place to call home. Ash could tell she was happy in being her trainer. It filled him in turn with a similar form of joy. In their 2 weeks of travel, Ash had also swapped around several of his Pokémon with those back at the lab, so they all had a chance to bond and spend time with him. And by so doing, he got to see firsthand just how amazingly well all of them had grown. It really was a miracle trick, having his Pokémon train just as hard back home as they did with him. It paid off so well, in fact, that he was almost certain Magikarp was close to the point of evolving. His scales had turned very bright in color, and that was typically a sign that Magikarp were about to evolve. It was for that reason that Ash resolved to switch Pidgeotto out for Magikarp as soon as his battle at the Vermilion gym was over. One of the biggest accomplishments that had been made recently though was finding the ideal food for Dragonite. Ash had spent much time in trial and error trying to craft a unique type of food that she would enjoy, and thankfully, he had finally managed to do so. Obviously, the most glaring issue feeding a Pokémon of her size was the sheer volume of food it would take to sat her needs. It would have been as impractical as it was financially impossible to keep up with such a tremendous burden the normal way. Thus, a unique type of food was born. During one of the times over the last 2 weeks in which they passed by a Pokémart for resupplying, Ash purchased a raw mixture of Pokefood that was meant exclusively for water types. Interestingly enough, Wailord Blubber was one of the ingredients in the mix which Dragonite ended up loving, leading Ash to believe that Wailord were most likely one of the common forms of prey she hunted during her years wandering the oceans. Regardless, he then spent considerable time mixing the raw base with different types of berries, seeking to find the ideal recipe that she would enjoy, as well as fill her massive stomach. In the end though, it was his mother who he once again had to thank for providing the answer to his problem. Shortly before leaving on his journey, Delia had presented him with a very special berry that she apparently obtained at the Xanadu nursery. That being the greenhouse where his garden-loving mother purchased nearly all of her supplies. The berry in question came from the Hoenn region and had been bestowed the aptly named Enigma berry. So called because, amazingly enough, its special ability was that it provided whatever need the possessor had in any kind of food they prepared. Which, in Ash's case, had been the need for a dietary filler that would fill Dragonite's massive stomach without breaking his credit account. Thankfully, the trick paid off and Dragonite not only loved her food, it also filled her appetite. The best part was that he only had to feed her slightly more in quantity than his other Pokémon. He himself had no idea what kind of flavor the unbelievably powerful berry had, but it must not have been unpleasant since she seemed to greatly enjoy her meal every time he fed her. The best part about an Enigma berry was that the rumors of its supposed rapid growth were indeed true. Though they were very rare, his mother told him that if someone attained an Enigma berry and planted one of its seeds in the ground, it would sprout into a very small tree overnight, leaving a precious few ripe Enigma berries to be plucked. Indeed, Ash put the theory to the test one night before bed, planting a single seed in some loamy, moist soil near their campsite. Upon awakening the next morning, he had been astounded to see a small tree with 2 ripe Enigma berries on its branches. Truly a miracle sent from Arceus herself if he had ever known one. Considering Pokémon food also made Ash realize just how unique his own Pokémon were when it came to their preferences in food. And since he made a common practice of tasting their food before giving it to them, he had quite a bit of experience with the taste of their food. Dragonite's recipe was rather bitter but had a sweet, savory aftertaste. He largely suspected the bitterness to be from the Wailord Blubber in the mix, but since she liked it and it filled her stomach, he wasn't about to try and change her mind. Charmander's food was designed to help strengthen his fire core and heighten his overall heat output to far greater levels. In Ash's opinion, it smelled and tasted rather spicy. On the completely opposite end of the type spectrum, however, Squirtle's food was made to help him become faster and more agile on both land and sea. It was also very beneficial in helping him to build up the power of his water pressure. It tasted sweet but yet had a slight hint of lemony zest to it that Squirtle adored. Indeed, even when it came to something as simple as food, Ash was amazed at how unique and varied Pokémon could be. Admittedly, he was also a trifle concerned about how Professor Oak was going to handle the situation once he found out about Dragonite. While he figured the wizened researcher would be amazed and, ultimately, overjoyed to see his student had made such an incredible catch, Ash was at least slightly concerned the shock may be a bit much on the older man. Either way, the matter would be resolved soon enough once he finally got around to sending Dragonite to the professor. The last, and undoubtedly most perplexing, issue on Ash's mind was both Misty and Jizelle. Or, more specifically, how he felt about both young women. While Ash labored under no delusion that he was not 10 years old, he was also fully aware of his advanced maturity in certain areas than those of his peers. Most especially when it came to girls. He didn't know whether it was just the way his mind worked or if he was simply a very early bloomer. Ash never found girls icky, or gross, even when he was much younger. In fact, he could still remember very well the fun and pretty little blonde he had met at Professor Oak's summer camp in Pallet Town when he was 5. Shortly after meeting Arceus and beginning his pupilship under Professor Oak, he met a young girl whom he had struck up quite the friendship with while they were in camp together. She had been rather shy and he was initially reluctant to take part in the camping activities in the first place, yet both his mother and Professor Oak had been insistent that he join in, saying that he needed to get used to interacting with others outside of the two of them and the Pokémon at the ranch before he set out on his journey. Regardless, he had indeed taken part, and in the midst thereof he met the pretty young girl in question. They had become rather close during their time at camp together, and he had been greatly saddened when, at the end of summer, she and her mother moved away to the far-off Kalos region. Either way, even then he never had any issues with girls, and now, at his present age, he had started to develop feelings for the two girls that were currently in his life. Feelings he felt were perhaps beginning to transcend simple friendship, even though they had only known one another for a relatively short time. Misty may have been temperamental and fiery, but that was only when she was angry or around people that greatly irritated her. But since he was so laid back and calm, most of the time, that really wasn't an issue between them. Behind all the brash and snippy tendencies of the orange-haired girl, she was also loyal, determined, committed, and possessed a very kind heart for both Pokémon and people, even if she tried to hide it where the latter was concerned. Jizelle was sweet, fun-loving, exceedingly intelligent, and always erring on the positive side of things. While she may have been snooty and a little uppity during their first meeting, she had mellowed out and become far more enjoyable to be around during their short time of traveling together. He and Misty both had a competitive and athletic penchant that complemented each other well. When it came to sparring their Pokémon and engaging in friendly little competitions on the road, they meshed well and had great fun. Likewise, he and Jizelle enjoyed sitting together calmly in the evenings around the campfire and discussing any and everything Pokémon Academia related, as well as enjoying a companionably silent read together of any of the few books they carried around with them. Sometimes swapping literature or even reading from the same book. Yes, while he got along wonderfully with both girls and liked many things about each one, Ash found himself growing increasingly conflicted concerning the feelings he felt beginning to stir in his young heart for them. It was bad enough that he really didn't know how to handle such blossoming feelings for two different girls without compromising his friendship with either one. What made it so much worse was that, while he knew he was developing certain feelings for Misty, slightly more so were those same amorous emotions forming for Jizelle. He didn't know whether it was her feminine charm, admittedly more blossoming physical features and aesthetic beauty, or her noticeably more calm and laid-back demeanor, similar to his own, but Ash knew his feelings for her were outpacing those he had for Misty. Even though those same feelings were steadily growing for the Oranguette more and more all the time. And such was his current internal struggle. They had only known each other a short time, how could he broach his feelings to either girl, if at all? He was younger than both of them, did they even feel the same way? He wasn't afraid of being in a relationship, even though he knew he was only 10. It wasn't as if any of it would become serious anyway, they were all far too young for that. While he was emotionally mature enough to realize and even rationalize many of the issues facing his current ordeal, others he was utterly at a loss to. How could he handle having feelings for both girls but with one being greater than the other? Even though the former was growing steadily as well. All of it was made even more difficult by recent actions Jizelle had taken, which totally threw him for a loop and further worsened his romantic affliction for her. Only a day after they left Bill's lighthouse, Ash had been training with his Pokémon during a break for lunch they had all decided to take. Brock had been cooking, Misty was reading one of her small, travel-sized books on water types, and their Pokémon were lounging free in the pleasant atmosphere of the day. It had been particularly hot since they were still near the coast, and so Ash decided to work out without his shirt on, as per usual, and also to convert his track pants into shorts. He had just been about to start his workout when Jizelle suddenly came up to him wearing matching teal workout shorts and a shirt with her hair pulled back into a ponytail. Before he could even ask what she was doing, she beat him to it by asking if she and her Pokémon could join in his training. Initially, he had been well beyond shocked senseless. Up to that point, none of his friends had ever asked to join in on his training regimen due to the sheer intensity of it. Yet, after overcoming his surprise, he had been more than happy to welcome the nervous-looking brunette and her Pokémon to join in. At the start of the training session, it was abundantly clear that she had always been more of a studious mind than the athletic type, very unlike Misty. And even though her Graveler and Cubone were reasonably strong in their own right, their lack of intensive, integrated training was also evident. Especially when in comparison to his own Pokémon. It was both amusing and even somewhat, well, appealing for Ash when, at the end of that day's workout, he saw Jizelle sprawled out on the ground, breathing hard and soaked in sweat. Her Pokémon had been laying nearby in much the same condition as their trainer. He fully expected her to never ask to train with them again, but, once again to his great surprise, she came back for more the next day. And the next day, and the day after that. All the way up until, over the last 2 weeks, Jizelle and her Pokémon had become regular additions to Ash's training regimens. In the matter of simply a few days of training, not only had he managed to help her get her Pokémon on a program that was designed to allow Graveler and Cubone to grow in their own respective areas, they had also formulated the ideal nutrition plan for them. They had also succeeded in helping Jizelle craft a workout regimen for herself that would improve her own physical prowess and overall fitness in a way that was right for her. While similar in some aspects to Ash's workout regimen, there were differences in Jizelle's that were needed for her own feminine form versus his obviously more masculine one. Specifically when it came to things like lifting, since, even though he was only 10, he did a rather intense degree of weight training. While he would admit to himself that the new pastime he and Jizelle enjoyed together only complicated his feelings for her even more so, he would not deny that it was very nice finally having another human partner to train with. Well, Ash, you only need one more badge after this one to qualify for the Indigo League. Brock suddenly spoke up from beside Ash, breaking him from his thoughts. The boy took a deep breath. Yeah, you're right. And I'll still be about 8 months ahead of schedule too. He then shrugged. But I guess it'll all work out pretty well since I really want to earn all the badges in Kanto, not just the necessary 8. It'll be great training in preparing us for the Indigo Conference, and we'll get to travel across the whole region too, which I've always wanted to do. The enthusiastic young rookie gave a bright eye smile as he raised a single finger. And besides, the chance of getting to meet new and awesome Pokémon never hurts things either. Misty merely rolled her eyes playfully at his comment as she stood on his other side, Jizelle being beside her. What, Ash, seeing and catching a massively huge Dragonite not good enough for you? The young, messy-haired trainer shot her a toothy grin in reply. It's never enough, Mist. You should know that about me by now. Yeah, Dragonite is great, but if she was out there, I can't imagine just how many other awesome Pokémon that are just waiting to be discovered. The Oranguette gave a small little chortle of amusement in return. Sure, whatever you say, Mr. Ash Ketchum all. He himself laughed at her light jest but then turned his attention back to the road that led down from the hill and into the city. As they started on again at a steady pace, he found himself reflecting on the 3 gym badges he had already earned over the last 2 weeks since leaving Bill's lighthouse. XXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXXX It wasn't all that big and was only a day's detour from the main road. The town was large enough for an urban living area and a small shopping plaza, and that was about it. The gym itself was located in a warehouse and was situated farther away in the forest, a short ways from town. In fact, if one didn't know what to look for, then the gym would have been a very easy place to miss. The inside of the warehouse looked almost exactly the same as the forest that surrounded it outside. There were cultivated trees, bushes and shrubs everywhere, as well as massive spider webs which were strung all throughout the gym. The battlefield was official league standard in size and was surrounded by yellow crates, also covered in webs, on every side. The gym leader himself was a boy around Brock's age. He had short silver hair that stood up on the end with green eyes. He wore green pants with lime-colored shoes on his feet, a long-sleeved sweater and a light undershirt beneath it. Both articles of which were just as green as his pants. Strangely enough, it had seemed as though actual spider webs were also draped over his shoulders, and even his clothes had black webbing designs on them. To top off the unusual look, he wore glasses with lenses that were shaped to look like a Venonat's eyes. The boy's name was Iggy and he specialized in bug-type Pokémon. He was a nice boy, if not a little strange. Especially considering the way that he talked about insects like they were the most important thing in the world. He had a rather high-pitched voice and constantly spouted off a variety of facts all about bug Pokémon. Ash had done his research before going to the gym in question and prepared his own team of bugs to take Iggy down with. He wanted to show that his bug-type Pokémon were superior, and in that initiative, he certainly didn't disappoint. The match had started with Iggy choosing a Beedrill as his first Pokémon. Ash used his own Beedrill, and with the selections made, the battle officially commenced. Iggy had trained his Beedrill well and it knew some impressive attacks. However, Ash's own Beedrill was not only stronger and faster, due to the intense training that he went through with Butterfree and Metapod, he also possessed a strong arsenal of moves. Attacks which he had perfected. He knew the moves: Fury Attack, Twineedle, Focus Energy, Rage, Pursuit, Toxic Spikes, Pin Missile, Agility, and his strongest move to date, Poison Jab. After trading a few blows back and forth with moves like Fury Attack, Twineedle and Pursuit, Iggy's much less hardy Beedrill had taken a beating. The silver-haired gym leader had commanded his weakened Pokémon to attack Ash's Beedrill with Pin Missile, and that was the fatal mistake. As a counter, Ash had ordered Beedrill to use Agility to dodge, and, having easily done so, he was able to quickly zip in around his slower cousin's defenses in order to strike back with Poison Jab. Exhausted and unable to move in time, Iggy's Beedrill took the attack head-on and was knocked out of the air, dropping to the ground like a lead weight soon after. Its defeat was proven evident by the swirly rings of unconsciousness in its eyes. The next match had been between Iggy's Pinsir and Ash's Butterfree. The latter had learned a few new moves since last being with his trainer, again made wholly possible due to the strict training regimen he took part in back at the lab. A regimen which had made Butterfree strong, even more so than Beedrill. He now knew the moves: Confusion, Sleep Powder, Poison Powder, Stun Spore, Gust, Supersonic, Whirlwind, Psybeam, Silverwind, and Tailwind. The battle itself had been incredibly intense, mostly because Pinsir was quite strong and knew some powerful moves. It kept trying to grab hold of Butterfree, but the faster Pokémon would manage to avoid it every time. Ash had Butterfree use moves like Gust and Sliverwind to knock Pinsir off balance and then hit it with either Psybeam or Confusion. The battle only ended when Pinsir finally trapped Butterfree in its crushing pincers and began squeezing him hard. Acting fast on his feet, Ash had commanded Butterfree to use Sleep Powder while he was still able to at least partially move his wings, and as soon as the powdery, hypnotic flex fell down upon Pinsir, it almost immediately went straight to sleep. Capitalizing on that sudden change in momentum, Ash had called for Butterfree to use a Psybeam-enhanced Sliverwind. And even though he was hurting from the painful squeeze Pinsir had put him through, Butterfree managed to summon all of his willpower to execute the combination attack. An attack which the sleeping Pokémon was unable to avoid and therefore successfully got knocked into unconsciousness because of. The last battle of the match had taken place between Iggy's Venonat and Ash's Metapod. A matchup no one understood at the time save for the raven-haired boy himself. The battle had seemed one-sided for the longest time, with Venonat continually hitting the cocoon Pokémon with attacks like Tackle, Confusion, and Leech Life. All Ash did, at first, was order Metapod to use Harden to the maximum and then allowed Venonat to hit him all across the battlefield. Every time Metapod would get knocked into a new spot, Ash would have him use String Shot and aim it at seemingly random places all over the gym. However, eventually the entire battlefield ended up being covered in that very same thick, sticky webbing. It got to the point where Venonat started to have trouble navigating around the maze of sticky, stringy webs without getting stuck, and on top of that, it had also grown tired after attacking Metapod so relentlessly. It was only then that Ash's strategy became evident. With Venonat encumbered, he ordered Metapod to start launching himself off the webs he himself had spun and used Tackle to strike his opponent. Being so exhausted and unable to freely move, Venonat became a target for Metapod to ceaselessly clobber with a repeated volley of constant, full-body tackles. This, in turn, made Venonat resemble a pinball as it was knocked all across the battlefield from web to web. Then, at last, the battle came to an end when Ash ordered Metapod to use one final tackle combined with Bug Bite. Launching himself like a slung stone one last time, the green-shelled torpedo slammed into the staggering Venonat at full speed, finishing it up with a painful bite straight down on the other Pokemon's much softer, far more vulnerable form. How Metapod even had a mouth in the first place, and only when using Bug Bite, was still a mystery to Ash and nearly every researcher out there, including Professor Oak. As an unexpected bonus to winning the battle and, by extension, the match, the victory had been all Metapod needed to boost him to evolution. And thus, before the eyes of everyone, the formerly plain, mostly immobile Pokémon transformed into a beautiful, winged and graceful Butterfree. It had been a truly memorable moment for Ash. Not all that long ago, Butterfree had been naught but a small, untrained little Caterpie, abandoned by his trainer and taken into Melanie's care. Yet, after much tender loving care, some intense training and unwavering devotion from his new trainer, Caterpie had grown by leaps and bounds. Of course, Ash knew he couldn't take all the credit. His first Butterfree and Beedrill had been responsible for helping to mentor and tutor Caterpie during the time in which he was at the lab with them. They had just as much to do with the newly evolved bug-type's success as Ash did, and he would gladly share that credit. He knew that Butterfree and Beedrill would be happy to see their protege having reached full maturation and at last be able to take flight together as a trio. Thankfully, to avoid mixing them up, Ash had also made the rather wise decision to tie a scarf around the necks of both Butterfree as soon as he had a chance to do so. A yellow one for his first and a green scarf for the second. Even though his first Butterfree was actually bigger than the second, he still didn't want to take chances, especially not as the latter grew larger. After attaining victory in the gym match, Ash was praised by Iggy for his strategic abilities and the amazing way in which he raised his bug-type Pokémon. Therefore, as proof of his triumph, Ash was awarded the Cunning Badge. The badge itself was green and shaped like a big, circular bump. It had 4 smaller bumps on the 4 bottom sides of it and a large orange bump on the top. With their small detour in Andon Town accomplished due to his victory over Iggy, Ash and his friends left and made their way to their next detour on the way to Vermilion. Their next stop had been at Sarah's city. It was a bit of a detour from their main destination, but well worth it indeed. Especially considering that Ash's next gym bout was located there. Since the Bay of Vermilion played host to several coastal populaces, much like Vermilion City itself, Sarah's city was one of the larger communities that one would find in that particular area of Kanto. It boasted a number of modest skyscrapers, an expansive urban housing area and a sizable market district. The city had a beautiful view of the bay from the front, and as a backdrop, one could just see the silhouette of mountains. The Pokémon gym itself was actually located right in the heart of the city and was situated in a big square building that was made almost entirely out of glass. The inside of the gym resembled an office lobby, and the battlefield was in a conference-style room that was more than large enough to battle in. The walls and ceiling were all made of extra durable plexiglass, and the room itself was high up enough in the building that it gave a spectacular view of the bay. The gym leader was a very professionally dressed man who had appeared to be in his 30s and wore a pin-striped business suit. He had dirty blonde hair slicked down with styling gel and a rather thin-looking face that was characterized by the sophisticated-looking glasses over his blue eyes. The man's name had been Ethan, and he spoke in a decidedly persnickety voice. He specialized in multiple types of Pokémon instead of merely one, and therefore, Ash had no need of putting together a specific team to combat him. The first battle of the match had been between Ethan's Machoke and Ash's Charmander. Machoke ended up being very fast and aggressively brutal with its attacks, hardly ever stopping and showing impressive endurance. Luckily, Charmander had the same kind of stamina and was able to keep up with all of the fighting-type attacks as they came his way. Utilizing his smaller stature and superior agility, Charmander had managed to evade and avoid the powerful strikes Machoke delivered and responded by hitting the larger Pokémon with attacks such as Slash and Fire Fang. However, when Machoke had finally succeeded in making contact with Charmander using Low Kick, the muscular fighting type barraged him with a punishing revenge flurry that ended in a painful Mega Punch which sent the fire lizard smashing into the ground. In a twist of events though, Charmander showed his spirit by standing back up with eyes that had begun to burn red with fury. Knowing that rage was on the way, Ash had commanded Charmander to use Smokescreen and blind Machoke. Successfully, the angered fire type had done so and bathed the field in a thick curtain of black smoke, which provided the perfect cover for their counterattack. They did so by Ash ordering Charmander to strike back at Machoke through the smoke with Flame Burst, immediately being followed up Slash and Fire Fang. With the hazy screen of inky blackness obscuring its vision, Machoke could do nothing but act as a target to receive each one of Charmander's rage-enhanced attacks. An onslaught which culminated in him building up all of his energy, on Ash's behest, to release a powerful Dragon Rage Blast. The draconian attack, fueled by rage just as all the others had been, not only hit the mark dead on but the force was so great that there was a temporary fear the glass walls and ceiling might crack. Thankfully, they hadn't, even though Machoke had been effectively rendered unconscious by it. The next battle had taken place between Ethan's Rhyhorn and Ash's Squirtle. Rhyhorn was a pure powerhouse Pokémon and relied heavily on its mass and full-throttle attacks to try and take Squirtle out early on. Thankfully though, the hardy turtle was both fast and light on his feet due to all of the harsh training he did on land and sea while they had been traveling along the coast of the bay. Therefore, he had been able to keep up with Rhyhorn far easier and dodge its attacks with far greater efficiency. Professor Oak had often said in his many helpful moments of offering sagely wisdom that speed was a Pokémon's best friend in battle and Ash could see why that was so. In fact, even though he wore a bulky shell, Squirtle demonstrated firsthand how effective their training was by lithely and quickly jumping, feinting and even rolling away, on his shell, from every brutish attack Rhyhorn attempted to level at him. When it came to attacking instead of simply evading, Ash made a working strategy of Squirtle getting around Rhyhorn's own natural, sturdy defense by first firing either a salvo of bubbles or a jet of water at the quadruped to distract it. After that, he would typically launch a broadside aquatic attack long distance at Rhyhorn or, in at least one very effective circumstance, slide up under the larger Pokémon's belly and blast it from beneath with water gun. Thankfully, the force of the water jet was also great enough to push Squirtle out from under Rhyhorn and a safe distance away across the battlefield. Unfortunately, during the time in which Squirtle tried to use the same trick twice, Ethan surprised them by ordering his wetted Rhyhorn to drop all its weight down onto the turtle beneath it using Body Slam. And thus it did. Turning its pain into an effective tool for reversal, Rhyhorn had simply dropped itself down onto Squirtle before he could rocket out from under it via another water blast. This worked in such a supremely effective manner that Squirtle had been firmly trapped under Rhyhorn, who was content to simply lay upon him until he passed out from lack of air or simply gave up. Thankfully, Ash's quick mind came up with an emergency maneuver to escape their dire straits by ordering Squirtle to use Water Pulse and Bubble, alternately, while trapped under Rhyhorn. Squirtle managed to turn his head just enough to shoot a salvo of bubbles that made contact with Rhyhorn's soft underbelly and caused great pain to vex the much larger Pokémon. Compounding the assault, the determined turtle also fired off several spheres of water up into Rhyhorn's stomach, his opponent finally beginning to flinch and recoil from the extremely effective, painful attacks. Along with the lapse of focus that occurred due to the pain, Rhyhorn had begun to raise up slightly off of Squirtle and that had been all that was needed. As soon as he felt himself gain enough wiggle room to move, the crafty water type had spun around onto his back and launched the most powerful water pulse yet into Rhyhorn's stomach, which sent the horned Pokémon hurtling upward into the air. As it began to fall back down though, Ash had hurriedly commanded Squirtle to use what he had so eloquently called Rapid Pulse. A combination move Squirtle had been working on which was essentially Rapid Spin and Water Pulse used in tandem. And thus, taking to the air while spinning like a ball toy on a merry-go-round, Squirtle began to relentlessly strike Rhyhorn over and over again. All the while he also fired large balls of highly condensed water out of his shell at his type-inferior opponent, adding further insult to a very painful injury. Moreover, due to the high-speed force of Squirtle's spinning attacks, as well as the increased power of each water pulse, Rhyhorn was kept aloft, despite its heavy mass. Finally, at the apex of another successful hit, Ash had yelled for Squirtle to use Tackle from above. This had been accomplished by Squirtle spinning straight up toward the ceiling and shooting a blast of water out of the back end of his shell, where his tail was, using water gun. This sent Squirtle rocketing back down toward Rhyhorn, all while still firing multiple spheres of water at the rock ground type that each hit their mark and caused increasingly devastating amounts of damage. Therefore, when Squirtle at last met Rhyhorn midway in the air, his speed-enhanced tackle caused his cranium to meet that of the other Pokémons in a direct clash. Due to all of the sudden and crippling damage Rhyhorn had received, especially from the many effective water-type moves, the much smaller Pokémon had easily been able to overcome it in their temporary head-to-head clash and sent the pre-evolved form of Rhyhorn crashing into the wooden gym floor below. It came as no surprise that Rhyhorn had been rendered soundly unconscious by that final attack, but celebrations could not be had since the final battle of the match occurred between Ethan's Ponyta and Ash's Bulbasaur. The young rookie trainer had played the entire battle very safe because of the glaring type disadvantage between the two opponents. This meant that Ash had Bulbasaur stay light on his feet the entire time and never allowed him to remain in one place too long because of the multitude of fire-type attacks that Ethan kept having Ponyta use. Things were most definitely not made any better by the fact that Ponyta was very fast, as per most members of its species. Everything seemed to have gone particularly sour at one point when Ponyta had, inevitably, finally managed to catch Bulbasaur by coming down on him with a staggering blow from its hoof using Stomp. Thinking their moment of fortune had arrived, Ethan ordered his final Pokémon to use Fire Spin. Although, just before Ponyta could deliver what would have undoubtedly been a crippling attack to the vulnerable grass type, Ash, acting on sheer reflex, yelled for Bulbasaur to use Vine Whip on the metal rafters above the battlefield. Just as the spiraling circle of Ponyta's flame came bearing down upon him, Bulbasaur had used his vines to slingshot himself up onto the rafters, just narrowly evading certain doom. His unorthodox mind working a mile a minute, Ash had Bulbasaur all but turn the metal beams above into a jungle